This is a Frontline Club event recorded on the 2nd of July 2020. We discuss the economy with Professor Joseph Stiglitz, Stephanie Flanders, and Alistair Darling.
Good evening for all those of you who are joining us from Europe and the UK, and good afternoon in America, and welcome to this session of the Frontline events on COVID and the economy. I'm very happy to welcome our guests for this session. Joseph Stiglitz, Nobel Prize winning economist, who's been the chief economist as well for the World Bank, currently a professor at Columbia University in New York and a critic of the way the world's governments have managed globalization. A very warm welcome to you. Also joining us, Alistair Darling, former solicitor, Labour politician who's held many cabinet posts in the British government, but notably he was the Chancellor of the Exchequer during the financial crisis of 2008 and was one of the architects of the gigantic bank rescue package that is widely credited with helping to prevent a total economic meltdown. And finally, Stephanie Flanders, who's one of Britain's most respected economic journalists. She's written for the New York Times, the BBC. She was even a speechwriter for Larry Summers, I think. And now she heads the Bloomberg economics unit. So thank you to all of you for making the time. We have hundreds of people signed up. I know we're going to have a lot of questions. Let me remind those of you who want to ask questions, you can either type them into the question bar at the bottom of your screen, or you can electronically put up your hand, and if I come to you, you'll be able to ask the question in your own voice. I'm going to begin by asking all of you to comment on something that's puzzled me. I was around in the stress and the crisis management and mismanagement of the financial meltdown, or almost meltdown, of 2008. And at that time, people were saying things will never be the same again. Well, in fact, fast forward 12 years, and they did seem to, for most of us, revert to pretty much the way they'd been. Now we are hearing once again after COVID, economically, things will never be the same again. And I'd like to know whether you think that's true and why. Let's begin with Stephanie.
Well, thank you very much. I know that we're going to hear some fascinating comments on this from the others, so I'll try not to say too much. But I mean, I think there's a few unarguable things that I think will be changed in a lasting way. Obviously, there's going to be a big change in government spending and government debt as a result of this. We can talk about the scale of that later, but it isn't just about how much governments have had to borrow and spend in response to this. But the footprint of government has changed in a really significant way, because they've had to do things that we kind of forgot governments might do. Be employing a huge chunk of the workforce. There's over 9 million people in the UK on the furlough scheme. We'd kind of forgotten that government could do something that dramatic. Across Europe, we have governments taking equity stakes in companies. So there will be a lasting effect in terms of how much governments are involved in what companies are doing, maybe imposing conditions on support that they give down the road as we start to come out of this in order to support climate objectives, other things. We know a lot of that has been discussed. So I think we know there could well be a big change just in our expectations of government in a slightly different way than we saw in the global financial crisis. So there's that sort of things. I think there's also, fortunately, on the economy, I think we're not going to be able to avoid, even on the best scenarios, there's going to be scarring of the economy. I think particularly we know, everything we know about the long-term impact of losing your job or not getting your first job when you're young, tells us that there's a whole group of young people, millions of young people, who will see effects 10, 15 years from now in terms of their wages and what job opportunities they have. And that's if we do quite a good job, we know that they'll be affected. What we do with all that, I think we're probably going to talk about, and I know that Joe and Alistair will have plenty to say about it. I think it's up for grabs whether we actually change the system as a result of that, change where the global economy's going. you might have said after the global financial crisis that there were some big structural changes that had happened as a result of that, and surely everything will change as a result. And in fact, as you've suggested, we had very little change in the kind of basic rules of the road, especially for macroeconomic policy and economic policies. Of course, that seems possible again, especially when you see, you know, stock markets already being the ones to benefit most and come out quickly fastest from the recession. And we could also see negative political consequences from this. Just as we saw after the global financial crisis, you know, people elected who were actively going to make the problem worse. But I hope that those things, the change in expectations around government and the knowledge of what happened after the global financial crisis, not enough changing then, will produce a better outcome.
Professor Stiglitz, what are your thoughts?
First, let me say, I think there were some big changes as a result of the 2008 crisis. I agree with Stephanie. Some of the political changes that we're doing with the United States are directly traceable to some of what happened in 2008 and more directly to how we responded to 2008. There was a real sense of anger that the financial sector who had brought on the crisis was that they were saved and millions of Americans lost their homes and jobs. So I think the political consequences are something that we're living with very much and have had a global effect. Secondly, after the 2008 crisis, there was a retreat from hyperglobalization, and that will probably be accelerated by the pandemic. And let me now emphasize two other things that I think are going to come out. One is what Stephanie emphasized, that we have now realized how important government is. And we've had 40 years of denigrating the role of government. You know, after Thatcher, Reagan, it was all government was the problem. And everybody turned to government, both in 2008, where Alistair and Gordon Brown did a fantastic job. But again, in this crisis, they've turned to government. And countries like New Zealand, where you have good governments, have done a wonderful job. And countries where you have incompetent governments, like the United States, things have gone very badly. But also, the crisis, the pandemic, has exposed weaknesses in the private sector. It's not been resilient. Global supply chains have not been resilient. In the United States, we couldn't even produce the masks. Simple product like protective gear, let alone complicated thing like tests. So there's been a disillusion with the private sector. And then finally, we don't know how long the pandemic is going to last. If it continues, I think there will be not only the kind of scarring that Stephanie talked about, but there's going to be a shift away from products and technologies that involve a lot of labor. There's an extra cost associated with labor. That's a structural transformation. Markets don't handle these structural transformations very well. And this will be another role for government, which is facilitating the consequent structural transformation. And I think you'll see some governments manage it well, and some countries won't do very well.
Alistair.
Well, I agree with a lot of what has just been said, but I think at this stage, it really is too early to say what the world is going to look like when this comes to an end. Indeed, we don't know what shape and form that end will be. Countries all over the world are still trying to contain this virus, let alone deal with its consequences. And I may say, until we have got a system where you can effectively track and trace people and so isolate outbreaks, there's always going to be the fear that it's going to well up again and that there might even be a second wave. And, you know, I'm nervous about doing too many wartime analogies, but it occurs to me that it's a bit like saying in 1939, what will the world look like at the end of all this? well, nobody could possibly have foreseen. Although, that said, at the end of the Second World War, certainly in Europe and certainly in the UK, there were some good things happened. So, the welfare state, the National Health Service was established here. In Europe, there was a resolve to never again and, have a rerun of the nationalistic problems that they had in the early part of the 20th century. I think the second thing is, being a former politician, perhaps I can be forgiven for bringing politics into all this. A lot will depend on what the political fallout is. As both Stephanie and Joseph said, that in the last 10 years, you've seen a growth of a more populist, nationalistic type of politics, which has been dominating, large parts of the world. Will that continue? Now, if you ask me now, I would say that that nationalistic tendency is still the dominant one, where people have come to believe that by pulling up the shutters, you're going to cut yourself off from what's going on in the rest of the world. If, on the other hand, you get countries recognizing that actually you do need to cooperate, this coronavirus surely must demonstrate beyond peradventure that some things don't know national boundaries. If there is that more cooperative view, then I would be more optimistic, because following on that, if you get that more cooperation, for example, you can perhaps start reopening trade and building relationships upon which our economy depends. I think the point that Joseph just made just now, in relation to what the shape of government and what government can do, that also I think will actually go some rethinking. 10 years ago, I was regularly attacked for pursuing a Keynesian response to what was happening in our economy. We were told that the government was being irresponsible, spending all this money. But the obvious response is, if we don't spend this money, it will be so much worse. A recession could become a depression. Now, government in effect today, right across the world, is not only a lender of last resort, it's quite clearly an insurer of last resort, and it may well be in some sectors a provider of last resort. And that it's an insurance, if you like, for all of us. So I think that will change. There'll be other things too, that in people's working patterns and so on. But I think at this stage, you'd be extremely blessed with a wonderful foresight. You can tell me exactly what the world's going to look like. Not least because we're not even halfway through this at the moment.
I don't know if you can hear, there's this thundering noise. It's because it's rain, it's just a downpour here in London. So forgive me if it sounds like I've got drummers in the background, but it is the rain. So I guess the basic question is, how bad is it right now? How much trouble are we in? And let me ask it from the point of view of the mother of a young graduate who's about to come into the workforce. I mean, is that kid not going to get a job for a decade? And I suppose, is it much worse or better in the developed West? How bad is it? Who wants to break that up?
Well, I was hoping the other two would, and then I could just agree with them. Look, I think you have to be optimistic in some ways that it will take longer for people to get back into work. It really all depends on what the governments actually do. If, for example, governments carry on the support they've put in place in most countries or many countries, and if they don't cut it back prematurely, in other words, if they make sure that there's a run-on to when the economy is picking up, then the outlook will be better. But you are right that young people who have lost their jobs and in many cases weren't earning that much and don't have much financial resilience to fall on, they will pay a heavy price. But also people coming into the labour market, it will be very, very difficult. The government can do things that will provide jobs, but they wouldn't be the ideal entry into the labour market that you would want. But what I think we must avoid, and here I'm speaking from UK European focus, we must avoid getting that very high destructive level of unemployment we saw in the 1980s, where some people went onto the dole and frankly they never came off, and then were drifted in and out of employment, and that scarred not just their lives, but for other people too. But I think we do need to try and be optimistic here, because it doesn't need to be that way. But it does mean that governments have got to, I'm afraid, spend rather more than they might have contemplated. I know a lot of them done a lot so far, but the recovery period, as I said just a moment ago, is going to take a lot longer than people think, I think.
I do think there's a risk. Sorry. I think there's a risk that things will get a lot better, and we will forget that actually the economy being 5% smaller than it was at the beginning of the year is still a really bad recession. The scalings we've lost our sense of scale. We've had 20% falls in GDP, or, and a 30 million increase in unemployment in a matter of a few weeks in the US. And those numbers are going to come down very fast. And I think in some sectors, you will have job hirings and even more expansion of some sectors, because we know that some companies are going to be doing well in this period. We've already seen that. We saw it even in the jobs numbers in the US today. But the risk is that will sort of blind us to the fact that we still have a massive problem, which is very concentrated, and actually probably more concentrated than the global financial crisis, where the pain was spread across all workers, really, because they got a squeeze in their wages, but we didn't have the kind of spike in unemployment in particular sectors that you had seen in previous, say, in the early 80s. And I think that is the real worry, is how do you protect and give either training or jobs to those people, if not your son, then certainly a lot of young people who are just going to find the next year very difficult, because that they would have probably got jobs in the 5% of the economy that's going to be missing, that's not going to be functioning with social distancing.
Mm-hmm.
Let me agree with both Alistair and Stephanie, but add two things. One, we are really uncertain about how long the pandemic is going to last under the best of circumstances. And secondly, we don't know how well the government policies are going to work, and whether they'll be sustained. And here I want to emphasize how important it is that they be sustained. The United States spent an enormous amount of money, but very ineffectively. The programs were badly designed, and they were even worse implemented. And so one of the reasons we had such a large increase in unemployment was both the design and the implementation. But I'm a little bit more pessimistic than Stephanie. Yes, the unemployment rate is going to go down from the very high levels that we saw immediately after the pandemic started. But with the second wave starting in the United States, I don't think anybody thinks that the unemployment rate is going to go below 10%. And if you use a broader measure of unemployment, underemployment, people who have a job but making a fraction of their income, the true unemployment will be much larger. We're getting data now that suggests, unlike almost any other downturn, many people have been forced to take wage cuts. It's a very interesting, all of Keynesian economics, the theory was based on wage rigidities. What we're seeing here is a lot of people accepting wage cuts. And in that sense, you can say it's a good thing because it's spreading the suffering around, but it makes people more aware that things are not back to normal. And let me say then, the fact that it's likely to last far longer than the 10 weeks that people contemplated at the beginning means that the buildup of effects, bankruptcies, balance sheet effects on households and firms are going to have follow-on effects. And most importantly, because the uncertainties that I mentioned, there's going to be strong precautionary behavior. So even when people could spend, they have the resources, they're going to hold back both in the context of firms on investment, households on consumption. And again, we're seeing that in the data, that people are holding back on a lot of their on spending. So I think we even though this was a downturn whose origin was very different than 2008, it was a virus, it is now morphing into a more conventional economic downturn where lack of optimism, worries cause contractions in spending, and that feeds on itself unless there is strong government and well-designed government intervention and sustained government intervention.
Well, that brings me to the first of the questions, and I'm going to group them together because we have several on what governments can do to help us get out of this mess or to recover and help the environment or do something about climate change, which is so pressing. So Julia Davenport says, should we be thinking about spending only contingent on helping climate change? Somebody else is asking whether loans to companies to keep them going or loan guarantees should be offered on condition that the companies come up with a green way forward for themselves. In other words, can the bigger role of the state put some muscle behind revamping Western economies to mitigate climate change?
I think very much so. You know, some people said, you know, the hope was that after a few weeks of the shutdown, we would be able to pick up where we left off in January, February 2020. That I think was a misguided view, both in terms of how long it would take, but 2020, January, things weren't very good. We had a fossil fuel economy. We had an economy marked by a lot of inequality. We weren't going in the right direction. So never has government intervened with a magnitude that it has in this case. And therefore, I think as it intervenes, it ought to, you know, it's our money, you can say, as citizens, and we ought to have a say in the shape that it takes. That should affect how we allocate money. But I think it also involves the conditions that we put on those who receive the money. And while among those conditions, the most important have to do with climate change, I think there are also important conditions that have to do with treating labor, transparency in corporate governance. There are other conditions that I think ought to be imposed. We did some research that showed that money that was green and conditions with green could be just or more timely, labor intensive, big multipliers, bang for the buck, than other kinds of spending. So I feel very confident that we can use that money in ways that will sustain the economy in this critical period, but also move us to the kind of economy that we'd like to be.
But is there any evidence of it happening? Because it takes a kind of political commitment that I don't think I've seen. Stephanie, go ahead.
Some governments
sorry.
There has been, we did see early on, we saw the French government in its very quick loan to Air France insist that they cancel some of their shorter, very short haul routes in France. But I think it's quite striking that that remains the only big example that we have. And I think that's the only note of caution I would put on Joe. I think it's absolutely right on the fiscal side that as it happens, there's some really good timely job producing programs you could do that also would be retrofitting homes across the country and you don't need to be very highly skilled in order to do that, unlike building schools, for example. And I think that is great. I think as we've moved forward and as the desperation of some of these businesses, particularly small and medium-sized businesses, has become clear, I think the trade-off has changed a bit. Right at the beginning, people were like, yes, let's put lots of conditions. We want them to give proper employment rights to everyone working for them, not just have all these gig workers. We want to make sure they're committed to zero carbon within 10 years. And then you realize how long it might take to get the money out the door when you impose those conditions. And I think that's where there's a bit of nervousness. I think where you have the capacity to do that, and it's perhaps a large business like an airline that probably has a few months to play with, I think you can do that. I think, but when you're talking about, and Joe just spoke to the long-term consequences of these company failures, I think that we may have to rein in some of those ambitions when it comes to just the practicality of saving these companies now. It might speak to having more equity shares. I think one of the things that's a shame is how much of the loan, how much of this support has been through lending. So you're forcing companies to run up a lot more debt, which was already a problem, and might make things harder down the road. But you're also not going to necessarily have the same long-lasting leverage over them that you might have if you took an equity share.
Can I just add to that one thing,
Sorry,
which is,
go ahead.
One of the ideas that is being discussed is that as you take those equity shares, use them to create a sovereign wealth fund, which would give citizens some sense of ownership in our economy. So it's another way of a change to the structure of our society and our economy that the pandemic could help promote.
I was just going to inject a note of caution here. Firstly, I have no quarrel whatsoever with the idea that this is an opportunity for governments across the world, if we're serious about carbon reduction, to start putting money in things that actually achieve that. And there's been a lot of rhetoric about this, but there hasn't been too much in terms of concrete action and so on. But having been a minister, I can tell you that one of the big problems you've got is there is a huge gap between promises and rhetoric and actual delivery. And I would worry that whilst with big corporations, it's relatively easy to say, look, here's your bailout, if you like, or your loan or your equity stake. In return, you must do the following things. An awful lot of people are employed by very small businesses. I'm thinking of, if you take the hospitality sector at the moment, which is going to be hit, really quite substantially because of social distancing and so on. It's much more difficult to design a scheme that can, achieve, if you like, your environmental objections. And you're dealing with somebody, maybe a single employer who's got half a dozen employees, to tie them down to doing quite specific things. And whilst I am in no way disagreeing with my colleagues in saying that this is an opportunity, for example, to drive these things forward, remember, speed is of the essence here. Within a very few short weeks, the support systems in the UK are about to come to an end. And if we don't do something, and we haven't got things that will stimulate jobs, help people retraining that are actually on the ground, a lot of people are going to be unemployed. And I say that as living in a country where, frankly, the government's record on delivery has been pretty dreadful on just about everything. And I repeat the point, I think it was Joe Stiglitz who was making the point about confidence. Unless you've got a testing system that works, people will not have the confidence. If they become confident the government's on top of the situation, then they'll go and spend money. Then they'll be willing to do all sorts of things. But just at the moment, we're not in that position.
Stephanie, you were saying something before we began, and maybe you'd like to pick up the thread about confidence spending and what China showed us.
Yeah, we've had it's sort of used without doing too much of a plug, but we have at Bloomberg, we've got lots of reporters everywhere, and the economists, and it's quite nice when you can bring the two together. And actually, what we've looked at across economies is the sort of high frequency data for how quickly our economy is coming back. What was striking about China, and we saw it in the data, but we also saw it from the reporters who went to Wuhan as it was coming out of its lockdown, obviously before everybody else, was that the production goes back very quickly. And you've also seen that in Europe. It's relatively easy for people to, you reopen factories and people go back to work, especially in China where they kind of have to go to work. They're worried about doing anything else. But what you didn't see come back was consumption, and activity at the weekends would just fall off again. People weren't in restaurants, people weren't in shopping malls. And there's different explanations for that, but I think that one was potentially that people were not just worried about getting the disease, which they were very conscious of because it had been so prevalent in Wuhan, but also just worried about getting tagged by the system, because you had this very efficient tracking system on people's phones, where if you happen to be in a shopping mall and you get one case, well, that's you in your apartment literally only being able to step out to put your rubbish out for the next 2 weeks. So that we are seeing interesting cultural differences, whereas in the southern states, for example, where governors were opening up, in the same week I talked to someone who was, they were reopening the waffle houses in Atlanta, and the governor had not followed any of the advice, and people said this is way too soon. But, quite a lot of people were going to not just the waffle houses, but the gyms and the tattoo parlors. So there is a bit of a cultural difference, but it seems like for most of the population who are not sort of southern, or have a particular proclivities, it matters a lot how much risk they see. And if they think the government is on track, has got a good system in place, they have confidence they're not going to catch the disease, then they do come back. And in Germany, people are in the restaurants, they are going swimming, they're doing all these things, and things are feeling normal in a way that people didn't expect to happen so soon.
Mm-hmm. We've got a couple of questions here. This one is from somebody who wants to remain anonymous, but asks, will COVID-19 exacerbate income equality? And I'd like to wrap that up with a question I had, which is, are we also going to see a concentration of corporate power, up companies in trouble? And at the end of this, one of the lasting shifts will be a huge concentration of power in the hands of big companies.
I'm sorry, Elizabeth, a lot of that broke up at my end.
Oh, okay.
Can I make a comment on the income inequality, because I got that bit.
Yeah.
And I'm afraid the answer to that is almost certainly. And it's not like we were starting, from a perfect situation. At the very beginning of this discussion, it was pointed out that 10 years worth of austerity has brought in its wake the fact that a lot of people, they may have been in work, but they weren't earning that much. They don't have much financial resilience. And a lot of people, particularly the ones who went into hospitality, retail and so on, have lost their jobs or could well be losing their jobs. So yes, I think it will exacerbate it. I think the other thing is that we, since we need to look at the thing but wider than our own countries, the gap between developed and better off economies and those which are developing is immense. And a lot of those countries, which we don't hear that much about, in the day-to-day news, they undoubtedly are going to find it very, very hard. And many of them, of course, are coming off a base where, they've got, very high levels of poverty. So yes, it will, but it's another example of where things could change because, as the government, governments introduce their schemes to help people get back to work, then perhaps we could address this problem that really is eating into our societies and into our economies, where you have this huge differential.
Yeah, let me very strongly agree with Alistair. In many ways, the disease coronavirus has exposed the inequalities, particularly in health in the United States, because we haven't recognized the right of access to healthcare as a basic human right. But those health inequalities are very much related to income inequalities. A lot of the people, frontline workers on which we depend, are low-paid workers, and so they're another reason why they're coming down disproportionately sick and dying. The basic fact that many of the sectors that are adversely affected are low-wage, labor-intensive sectors mean that the demand for those services will almost surely decrease, at least in the short run and possibly in the long run. And that will by itself increase inequality. But then let me just emphasize the last point that Alistair made, which is it depends on how government responds. In the United States, there's been this enormous reaction against the racial injustices that have become very evident at the same time. And I think that's brought home the persistent inequalities in so many dimensions in our society. So I am very hopeful that come November in the United States, there will be a very big course correction. And when that happens, and the result of this will be a recognition that we were in the wrong direction. And I am hopeful that with that course correction, that we will actually address some of the would have been very persistent inequalities. On the other question you asked, Elizabeth, about increasing concentration, again, I worry about that. And particularly you see that in the way, again, I'm talking more about the United States, the Federal Reserve and the program called the PPP program went disproportionately to better off firms. And the firms that are better off can buy up firms that are not so well off. And there'll be more, the smaller firms are going to go bankrupt. There'll be more economic concentration. Again, it's policy. I'm hopeful that the next administration will take much more seriously problems of antitrust, of lack of competition. There is a growing consensus among economists in the United States that competition is a real problem. And as that consensus has grown, I think it's more likely that there'll be public policies to address it.
I can't hear Elizabeth. I think you're muted, Elizabeth. But I mean, I would agree with much of what's been said. I mean, I do think I'm maybe not quite so optimistic. I didn't think I would be on a further side of pessimism than Joe, but I'm not quite so optimistic about the reining in of corporate power, because I think some of the big tech companies and others that we were perhaps most worried about, not just in terms of the threat to competition that they present, but all the other things that they go with them. It's become so clear over the last few years that even the US government might struggle to really change their direction. I don't think it's impossible, but I think they have had an extra leg up, many of them, from this crisis. And I think it's going to take international cooperation to really make a difference. And I do worry about that coming out of this. I also think going back to what we said at the start, I mean, that although I've been talking about governments taking equity stakes in companies, obviously that comes with risks as well, because you end up having a sort of free-for-all of the richer countries being able to prop up their companies in a way that the poorer countries can't. You see that in Europe, particularly now. Germany, because the state aid rules have been suspended, Germany is giving a lot of loans to big, strong German companies who probably need it because they're facing these immediate threats. But the equivalent can't happen in Poland or Hungary, and the goal of those state aid rules to have a more level playing field and more competition within Europe gets defeated. So I think it's going to be very messy, and I think that corporate concentration point is going to be pretty hard to resolve, even with a muscular Biden administration, who will have plenty of other things to do if he does get to be president.
My internet's acting up, so I'm going to make a quick question and hope that I stay with you. Can the world afford a second wave of COVID?
So are you
I think
saying
that can the world afford a second wave?
Can the world afford a second wave, and can specifically the US and the UK afford a second wave this fall and winter?
The short answer is, strictly speaking, no, we can't. But we'd have to deal with whatever comes our way. I mean, I've always believed that at the end of the day, to come back to a point that we were all making earlier, that one of the functions of government is to protect its population when catastrophe hits, whether it's a virus, whether it's a war, whatever. And therefore, we have to do whatever it takes for however long it takes to ensure that we deal with it. Now, I think the better question in some ways is, why aren't we doing more to try and stop the possibility of a second wave? And there's enough evidence around in the world now of what happens if you do things prematurely. If the virus reestablishes itself. One of the things that that's actually new, certainly in the UK, is that there's been a feeling abroad amongst younger people that it's okay, we may get it, but nothing bad's going to happen to us. whereas we've seen recently there has been an increase in the incidence of younger people getting this virus, which is why, I fully accept you've got to get the economy going, but you've got to do it with, health very much in the front of your mind. And that's why, I keep coming back to this point, the ability to test and isolate those cases so we can actually see where it's coming from, who's affected, and then get on top of it. That is absolutely critical if you want to avoid a second wave. But, you'd be foolish to think that this will all be over, in a short period of time, then we can go back to wherever we were. The consequences of this, both in health terms and the risks that, there'll be another virus or a mutation around, or are we allowed to well up again? We must be on top of that. And frankly, only the government is in a position to take action. And it will be different in different countries. The cultures of politics are all different and so on. But, that's what worries me quite a lot at the moment.
I couldn't agree more with Alistair. Basically, if the pandemic turns out to last longer, we don't discover therapeutics or vaccines, it mutates in a way that's adverse. The basic question is, we will have to deal with the world as we confront it. And what does that mean? It means strong, sustained policies. As Alistair said, the role of the government is protect us as a society. It's a kind of collective action, doing things that we as individuals couldn't do. That means that we'll have to spend resources, but our resources will be less than they would have been if we had not had the pandemic. And so part of what will have to happen is, if the pandemic should last longer, say because of a mutation, we will have to make sure that there is a kind of shared sacrifice. Standards of living may have to go down. And those who are best able to accept that are the ones that need to contribute the most. Those whose income are at the bottom and can't be cut, we can't ask that of them. And unfortunately, if we do nothing, those were the people who will actually bear the brunt of the disease.
One thing I would say is, I agree with everything about the second wave. I guess what I would worry about globally is not having a second wave, but just a continuous wave that it comes partly from a big chunk of the global population being in countries that have just given up because they don't have the institutional capacity. And it's one thing we haven't spoken about, but of course, there are many emerging market governments, particularly in Asia, who have done a very good job, in some cases without very good resources, like Vietnam, relatively speaking. But there are many countries across Africa, Latin America, in many ways India, has just decided they can't afford lockdowns and it will, whatever happens will happen. And I think we're not quite grappling. That's not so much a second wave as just a global wave that will continue even if the UK gets its act together in other countries. And the implications of that a large chunk of the population is just going to be left to fend, of the world population is just going to be fending for themselves. And of course, there will be plenty of flow back and forth, but it can't be just about shutting our borders against those countries. I think I worry most about that because that's where the least capacity to deal with it is.
If I could add a postscript to that, which I agree with, is that surely this demonstrates yet again why the world needs to cooperate. We need international cooperation. Now, I said 10 years ago, one of the hugely helpful things is that the world's biggest economies more or less did the same thing, and they did it at the same time. And they made it, but the very fact that we're acting together gave people confidence, I think. But in a case like this, whereas Stephanie rightly says there are countries that have given up, there are people who have got absolutely no protection whatsoever. They're not getting income support. They don't have access to health service. People are kidding themselves in the better off countries. They think, oh, well, what's that got to do with us? Well, it's got everything to do with us because of not just the moral, the social, the economic, but the political consequences. If we ignore a very, very large number of people in this world, no matter where they happen to live, will be dire, which is why, whatever else needs to change, there needs to be a recognition that we all depend on each other one way or another. And we need we've got the institutions actually in many cases. We need to make them work.
Can I add a couple of specific things, ways in which we need to cooperate? Among the institutions, we have the IMF. It has the ability to issue special drawing rights, $500 billion. And so far, the United States has blocked the issuance of those drawing rights. So that was one of the things that happened in the aftermath of the 2008 crisis. There was this issuance of those special drawing rights. And this would make a very big difference for a number of countries. The second thing is there are going to be a number of debt crises. And the countries that go into debt crises, the consequences there will be devastating. The UN passed a resolution almost overwhelmingly for establishment of an orderly way of addressing debt crises, a sovereign debt restructuring mechanism. But unfortunately, UK and the United States voted against. That was in 2015. If we had had that in place, it would enable a much better restructuring process. Right now, we're seeing in the case of a couple countries that have already gone into default, things are not going very well. And the third thing is there's been a call for a standstill where the rest of the world has gone into, you might say, a hold. The financial markets are collecting interest and the poorer countries just can't afford it. And governments, Western governments, I think have to put a real pressure on their financial institutions to have this kind of a standstill.
We have a few questions that essentially ask the same thing, and that is, how long can even developed countries afford this? How long can the US and the UK governments continue to offer furlough programs and guaranteed income and loan guarantees? A year, 2, 5? When does the money run out? Or is it imaginary money? It never runs out. Stephanie, you're grimacing.
I think I was just smiling at the technical concept of imaginary money, but of course it does. There is very much lots of imaginary money out there which we should take. Look, I mean, it's as long as it takes. I mean, we started off the discussion saying that we had discovered, or people had been reminded, how much governments could do. And one of the things we've been reminded of is the almost unlimited capacity to spend in the face of something which, as Alistair said, could produce much greater cost down the road if we don't fix it. And I think one of the encouraging things about this has been how unified the economics profession has been, and indeed many policymakers of different stripes have been, in recognizing the need to, I guess the phrase at the beginning was to fill the hole. You know, just you have to try and fill that gap that was being immediately blown out of the economy by government's actions, and provide that insurance that Alice is talking about. I think, and there is also, though this I fear may change, surprising agreement about, though not complete agreement, about how quickly governments need to rein that in. As I think it might change. I think we might start to hear about austerity, but it's interesting how that is not evident in the conversation in the UK from a Conservative government or anybody else. And we haven't really heard it even from the more conservative voices in the Eurozone. We've seen Germany, I think, very confident that this shows that they were right to save their money all this time, but they have been happy to spend, and they've had one of the biggest fiscal support programs. Others will talk about the global conditions, but I think we've had very low borrowing costs. We've got even lower borrowing costs now, and no real reason to think that they're going to change anytime soon. So governments can afford to carry on borrowing, especially when the alternative is a worse recession, ultimately more costly.
But forgive me being maybe ignorant, but at some stage, don't you run out of institutions willing to lend? Like, how infinite is the money hole?
It becomes finite. Well, others will answer this, but it becomes more finite if you're the only country doing it.
Yes.
And it's particularly finite if you're the only country doing it who needs it, and you don't actually have control over your own currency, as some countries in the Eurozone have, for example. But we don't, at the moment, the very fact that every country is going through this, and the US, for example, looks like we'll have a 14-15% of GDP deficit, similar to the UK, makes it hard for investors to know where to put their money other than there. And investors, unfortunately, or fortunately, probably unfortunately in this case, have a lot more money than they did 6 months ago because the markets have been so buoyed by the actions of central banks.
So there's plenty of money put into the various pipelines for as long as it takes. Go ahead, Joe.
Well, I was going to say the point that Stephanie made, that with interest rates close to zero, the cost of servicing the debt is close to zero. And, it would make sense for Europe to issue perpetuities, consols of the kind that the UK issued a couple of 100 years ago, so that the cost of servicing the debt is even lower. Resources are scarce, that's true. And that is an important reason why one has to be thoughtful in how you spend money, and programs like the PPP program in the United States that didn't work very well have to be redesigned so that you get more bang for the buck. Absolutely. If it turns out that the pandemic lasts a very long time, not just, as I said, not a second wave, but a continual wave, our standards of living may have to adjust, and that's the real part of the economy. It's not the money part of the economy that worries me. It's the fact that in the end, we have to recognize that resources are limited, and how those resources are used is an important question, and government needs to play a very important role in making sure that those resources are spent well, that the vulnerable are protected, and that the direction of the future of our economy, like a green economy that the first question reflected, that we're moving in the right direction.
It begs a provocative question from me, and that is the United States government under President Trump able to do that? In other words, and would another term of Trump be catastrophic? Let me park that and with you. Meanwhile, Alistair, what about Brexit? A lot of people have said, how is Brexit going to factor in how the UK recovers from this? So I'm going to let you start with that while Joe thinks about how to handle the question about President Trump.
Well, we're 50 minutes into this discussion and Brexit hasn't been raised yet, so you've done very well. We've been talking about what governments should be doing, and that's important. But there's things that governments should avoid doing to make a bad situation worse. And one of the best things to avoid doing is ending up with a no-deal arrangement, following Brexit, because the European Union is our largest trading partner. I'm not seeking to revisit the referendum or its result. The public spoke last December on that. But we need to have some sort of deal with our biggest trading partner and with the continent of which we are physically a part. And that's important because not just because you need to deal with Europe, but also it will I think colour the whole debate as to how you engage with other countries. We need to reinvent our trading links with just about every country in the world, and we've got we're more than halfway through this year now, and we're due to leave at the end of December. And it is worth reminding ourselves that at the beginning of this year, before there was any talk about COVID, at least on this side of the world, it was reckoned that Brexit would result in a 4 to 5% hit in our economy. Now that hasn't gone away. And of course, you've got the COVID problem as well. So, and it's difficult to discern at the moment, as with so many things with our government here, as to what actually its policy is. And I see today that negotiations appear to have broken down again. Now, my best guess is that they will reach some sort of deal, which may be a deal that agrees to have another meeting and have another process. But simply tipping us into a no-deal situation would make the situation much, much worse than it need be. And also my experience as government tells me it's very difficult for governments to deal with more than one or two problems at once. So why visit a self-inflicted wound on ourselves when it is totally unnecessary? Say, I'm not seeking to reopen the thing. We are where we are on that. But we were promised, after all, by the Brexiteers that getting a deal would be no problem at all, and the Europeans would be only too happy to roll over and acquiesce with whoever we were going along with. We wanted. But that doesn't seem to have happened, surprisingly enough.
Just to say, before Joe warms up onto the subject of Trump, I think you've had a sort of appalling lack of disagreement on this panel, but I think that the organisers, I'm sure, knew the risks when they asked the three of us. But I do think that there is a danger that at least some on the government side or some associated with the government hear exactly what Alice has just said and know that the worst case is sort of 4 or 5% and think that somehow it'll be lost in the mix of COVID. And that this is a good opportunity to that no one will ever be able to really pin it on Brexit. So that's an extra reason to push ahead. Now, I like to think that our government leaders are much bigger than that. And they understand actually also that if there really was a no deal, the chaos at Calais and those things would be very clearly associated with Brexit and would not be lost in the mix. But I worry a little bit about that. And on the subject of relations with other countries, I think another thing which is very concerning is how much goodwill has been lost in the apparent lack of desire to implement the Northern Ireland Protocol, which we agreed to. And I think that's put an extra obstacle to the negotiations and taken away yet more goodwill. And I think it is deeply unfortunate. I've never really understood why the believers in Brexit would want to have the most costly version of Brexit. I would have thought they would want to have something, even if it was a very hard form of Brexit, they would want an orderly way of doing it. But that doesn't seem to be the case.
So Elizabeth, your question was not that difficult. Obviously, another 4 years of Trump would make things, he's not competent to deal with the pandemic, let alone most of the other issues the country is facing. If we look across countries, those who've managed the pandemic well, both in terms of the disease and in terms of the health of the economy, are countries in which there's trust in the government. You have to trust the government. There's trust in corporations that you can, if you get a test, the test actually works. Where there's social cohesion, where citizens respect each other. And so when they put on a mask, they know it's to protect not just themselves, but even more other citizens. It's a sign of respect for others. And in which there's a respect for expertise, that scientists bring something to the table to address something complicated like the disease. The Trump administration is based on dividing the country. There's no trust. With somebody who lies, 10 times a day, there's no confidence in anything he says, and there's he doesn't believe in expertise and has systematically every year asked for cuts in science of 30%. So the basic point is there couldn't be anything more the antithesis of what is needed in addressing the pandemic than Trump. To make it even worse, his allies in the Republican Party have approached the economics from an ideological perspective. So what is needed is a comprehensive approach. We've talked about climate change, making a knowledge economy, all those kinds of things. They don't want to even provide assurance that there will be a continuation of support for unemployment insurance. They don't want to provide any help for the states and localities. The states and localities are those at the front line in providing health, education, welfare payments. So that in turn, what has happened is really an undermining of confidence in the economy that we've all talked about as being so important. And so both in terms of the health response and in terms of economic response, I think were he to get reelected, we would be put in a very precarious position. It's looking less and less likely, and therefore I'm feeling more and more hopeful, as I indicated earlier. That's the silver lining in the current cloud. But you know, we know that politics is uncertain, and should he get reelected, I think to reiterate what both Stephanie and Alistair pointed out, it's a global problem. The pandemic, by its nature, is global, and if the United States doesn't control the pandemic, and if it doesn't respond in an effective way economically, I think it's going to make it very hard for there to be a global economic recovery, let alone a control of the pandemic.
Sobering. I'm going to go to Martin Emmett. I hope he's still there and wants to ask a question. He's been hanging on for at least half an hour. Martin, are you there? Nah, maybe he's given up.
He's on mute. He may not realize he's on mute.
Oh, wait. Yeah. I'm trying to unmute him. Martin, can you unmute yourself?
Yeah. Can you hear me now?
Yes, we can. Yeah. Hello, hello.
Hello. Hi, you wanted me to ask that question?
I do, yeah.
It's just, I think you might have covered it to some extent. We're now at a situation where the governments are rescuing companies and businesses by taking equity. Is this the exact time when perhaps there is a global crisis we seem to have forgotten about, where they could impose strict instructions and strict targets on the companies as the response to doing that?
So make the financial support contingent on various things. And which things do you think, in the case of Britain, might be appropriate? What would you like to see?
Well, I suppose less carbon output, perhaps. Right. Yeah. Making the transport, you know, less use of carbon fuel, and alternatives, using public transport maybe if it's appropriate.
Mm-hmm. Well, thanks very much. We did address that as you pointed out, and maybe we can come back to it and ask it roll it up with another question that came in, and that was, what should we be expecting from the private sector right now? We've heard a lot about the state, the role of the state, what it should do, what we hope it could do. What does the private sector have to step up and demonstrate right now, and what are the chances of it happening? Who wants to tackle that?
Well, I think we're already seeing it in terms of the innovation that companies have come up with when given half a chance to adapt the way they do business for social distancing. And I think it's been one of the things that has been frustrating for some business groups, was how hard it is to get information out of the government, and how they will get very late in the day the very detailed instructions from the government on social distancing just before things open up. But I think, you know, the longer that we are without a vaccine, the more scope, the more, I mean, and I think this is the difficult challenge that governments have, because you're probably in a position of erring on the side of saving jobs and protecting jobs. But if possible, you also want to be giving incentives for companies and employees to adjust to a socially distanced world and find a way to still have a functioning business in that environment. And you don't want to do anything that kind of holds that back. I think the structure of the furlough scheme initially was going to hold that back by being very all or nothing about whether someone was unemployed or not. That's changing, and I hope maybe it could get expanded it could be continued longer beyond October, but also be made more, continue to be flexible. But I think, you know, that will be the key areas, shrinking the amount of the economy that cannot function with social distancing. And I think obviously government clarity would help with that.
Let me mention a couple of areas where our companies, some of whom claim to be very socially responsible, have been acting in a very socially irresponsible way. One of them is that, and this is more American, and I hope this is not true in other countries, but for instance, a very large number of American companies do not provide paid sick leave. And Congress passed legislation recognizing that when low-income people don't have paid sick leave, when they get sick, they're going to go to work. It's a matter of survival. And when passed that legislation, America's largest enterprises, those with over 500 employees, lobbied hard and lobbied successfully to exempt themselves from this provision. 48% of American workers were exempt from the mandate of just paid sick leave for COVID-19. That was socially irresponsible. We have a government where we're supposed to have, under Trump administration, you're supposed to have provisions about occupational safety. One aspect of occupational safety is social distancing. But OSHA, the agency that doesn't, has not required face masks, has not required the kinds of things that would contain the spread of the disease. And in a few cases, I know in New York City, the union stepped in and demanded, but most of America, the unions have been weak. And so workers have had to go to work and expose themselves to dangers because they have nothing in their bank account. It's a matter of life and death, and they are confronting death as they oppose to go to work. The third example is, we've talked before about the international context and how important it is. One of the things that has been really quite amazing is in the context of the pandemic, there are a couple countries trying to renegotiate the debt. And the creditors, and this includes those in UK and in the United States, seem not to understand that there's a pandemic going on. And they've acted in the most irresponsible way. The IMF has tried to help. They've tried to outline what is the limit of sustainability, how much the countries can afford. And they are demanding far more than what is sustainable. And even worse, they've demanded that there be provisions in the contracts that make it more, make it easier for the vulture funds to come in and extract even more out of these countries. So with the financial sector, at least a few firms that claim to be socially responsible, are using this, the fact that the countries are down on the ground to put their knee on their neck and to say, now's the time, you better give in and agree to what we want, or we won't agree to a debt restructuring. It's inhumane, and I believe it is actually not even in their self-interest. It's another example of short-sightedness. But that's the kind of way the private sector ought to step up and act in a more humane and in a more long-term interest. I think it's the damage it's going to do to the international financial markets, the reputation of Western capitalism is going to be very severe.
Thank you very much. Sorry, did you want to add something, Alistair?
Very, very briefly. I was just thinking there are examples of where things, the imposition of regulations or natural things like, a virus can, make successful companies react positively. If you look, for example, in energy generation, 20 years ago, people said, look, you can't do any of this stuff without coal. And actually, here in the UK, for example, we've had days now, a number of days when all our energy has come from, green sources, wind farms and so on. And equally, if you'd said, 12 months ago, is it possible for large companies to work with 95% of their staff at home and not having to travel every day or go to conferences, around the world? They're saying that would be quite impossible to exist like that. well, people will adapt. I'm not saying it's easy, and sadly, some firms will not be able to adapt because the model just won't adapt. But that's why I think a positive can come out of things like, for example, the government saying, well, if you really want to meet your carbon emission reduction by 2050, here is what you've got to do, and here's a start. Get on with it. And most companies will adapt.
Thank you very much. We've almost run out of time, but I want to ask one question to each of you to close, and that is, what one single thing are you watching most closely coming into summer that preoccupies you or worries you, or you think is a really important indicator of where we're off to? Joe, do you want to kick off?
Well, the thing obviously that most worries me is an uptick in the disease, the second wave, or maybe the continual wave. And obviously, in the United States, we're much more sensitive because the numbers have reached new peaks, and every day or every other day sees a new peak. And we won't have an economic recovery until we have the disease under control. And to me, it's so sad because we've seen from some of the other countries that the disease can be put under control, and that there are economic policies that once the disease is under control, there can be an economic recovery. But what worries me is the damage, the scars that you began with in our discussion are going to be greater the longer the pandemic lasts. And so these mistakes are going to have, I'm afraid, long-term effects.
Your remarks hit home here because we're about to see the pubs reopen this weekend. Personally, I'm not going anywhere near them. Alistair, what are you keeping your eye on?
Well, the pubs aren't reopening where I am, not for a bit yet. My guess is the three of us will say the same thing, and that is, we're looking at the welling up of the virus in places where we hadn't seen it before, the possibility of a second wave, or actually the very real possibility of a long tail here that could go on for some time. Because I think it's probably fanciful to say you're going to be able to eradicate it absent a worldwide vaccination program, and we're nowhere near that. Finding the vaccine would be a helpful start. So that's what I'm looking at, because as Joe has just said, you will not get an economic recovery until people have got the confidence that their government and governments around the world are getting on top of this, and we're containing it and working towards its elimination. So that's the most important thing. And then near term on the economic side, obviously, next week we will get a glimpse of what the government's planning to do. Although my guess is that here in the UK, the Chancellor will be coming back to the House of Commons on a regular basis. Certainly I found 10 years ago, you don't fix this in one go. You keep having to come back and you keep having to adjust. And as Keynes is reputed to have said, when facts change, you change your mind. Nothing wrong with that.
Thank God for that magic money tree.
Well, and every chancellor who comes in and says, I'm going to get rid of all these other fiscal events and only have one, always seems to be foiled and always has to have multiple ones. I mean, I agree with everything that's been said. I think I will also be looking for, the virus is obviously going to shape what's possible. But within the realm of what's possible, we do really want to get a handle on how much companies have been able to hold on to and how many jobs are still there. And we get in the UK, as that furlough scheme changes at the end of July, and on the current trajectory, on the current rules, companies actually have to start contributing more towards the pay of those furloughed workers. I'm pretty worried about what that's going to start to show up in terms of lost jobs and company failures. We've already seen it. I think the FT actually calculated there's 100,000 already in terms of announcements of lost jobs. And that, I fear, could be just the beginning. But the upside, as we've said also, is where countries have brought the virus under control, and where they don't have those kind of cliff edges in their support programs, Germany and France, you are seeing a pretty sharp recovery so far. And so I'll also be looking to see if there is a bit of good news there.
Fingers crossed. Thank you so very much, all of you. I've really enjoyed this. I wish we had more time. I want to wish you all well and to thank everybody who participated. I'm sorry we didn't get to all the questions, but I think we addressed the main themes. So good evening to you. Thanks again, and goodbye.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Right.
Bye.
Thank you. Goodbye.